Battleships, Blackouts, and $7 eggs. Eggs go up $2, and America acts like the Book of Lamentations needs a Costco edition. Suddenly, everyone is Jeremiah at the breakfast table. Do you know what a dozen eggs costs now? Yes, Bubba, I do. Somehow civilization must survive this omelet-based apocalypse. Gas prices rise, and half the country immediately develops deep humanitarian concern for whichever terrorist regime happens to be sitting on oil. Funny how quickly never negotiate with evil becomes, but have you seen unleaded lately? Apparently, the moral red line ends at $4.79 a gallon. It is funny until it is not, because the problem is not that modern Americans complain. Our grandparents complained too. Jews have been complaining since Sinai, and frankly, the manna was probably dry. The problem is that we have been trained to treat discomfort as a system failure, inconvenience as injustice, and sacrifice as something that should always be assigned to someone else. We built a culture around the promise that everything should be available immediately, delivered quietly, and produced somewhere we do not have to look at. We want cheap energy, endless convenience, low prices, clean hands, smart everything, no factories, no pipelines, no sacrifice, and absolutely no consequences. We want the war effort without the factory. We want victory without rationing. We want civilization without anyone sweating near machinery. Then we look back at the generation that survived the Depression, built the arsenal of democracy, fought across oceans, defeated fascism, and came home to build again. And we talk about them as though they were a different species. They were not born with stronger bones. They lived in a culture that expected them to be useful. That is what I think about when I think about my Jewish grandparents in Brooklyn during World War II. Not Instagram Brooklyn, not artisanal nostalgia Brooklyn. I mean Brooklyn when the world was on fire. Brooklyn when blackout curtains went up because German submarines were close enough to make the glow of the coastline dangerous. Brooklyn when ration books sat in kitchen drawers like small paper reminders that private appetite had to answer to public necessity. Brooklyn when sugar, meat, gasoline, rubber, coffee, and comfort were not guaranteed. Brooklyn when Jewish families listened to the radio and understood that the war in Europe was not foreign policy. It was family news. I do not care which generational chart claims my grandparents. They were children of people who survived pogroms and adults in a world war. History had already entered their home twice, first through inherited memory and then through the radio. My grandfather built battleships in the Brooklyn shipyards during World War II. Read that sentence again. He did not build brand awareness. He did not build a personal platform. He did not write a newsletter about the emotional burden of rivets. He built battleships, steel, fire, noise, sweat, danger. The kind of work that makes your hands ache and your back hate you by dinner. The kind of work where civilization is not a concept debated over coffee. It is something you weld together before the enemy sinks it. He did this as a Jewish man in Brooklyn while Europe was devouring Jews by the millions. That was labor, but it was also defiance. Behind him stood another generation, the parents and elders who had survived pogroms in Ukraine and Russia before the Holocaust gave the world a new vocabulary for Jewish suffering. They had already seen what happens when mobs are told the Jews are the problem. They had seen homes looted, communities shattered, families scattered, and memory turned into luggage. So when my grandparents faced wartime Brooklyn, they did not meet history as innocents. They inherited a survival manual written in Yiddish whispers, family silences, and stories adults stopped telling when children entered the room. Then America entered the war. The government said sugar is limited, meat is limited, gas is limited, rubber is limited, coffee is limited. You want more? Mazel tov. So does General Eisenhower. There were ration books, stamps, lines, substitutions, and recipes that began with take whatever you can get and ended with pretend this is cake. People complained because people are people, but they understood a distinction our culture is rapidly losing. Complaining is not collapsing. When America said use less sugar, they tightened the belt. When America said dim the lights, they pulled the curtains. When America said build, my grandfather went to the shipyards. Ships did not build themselves. Victory did not arrive by vibes. Somebody had to weld, somebody had to rivet, somebody had to show up tired, do dangerous work, and go home smelling like metal and oil. The war was not won only by the men carrying rifles. It was won by millions of ordinary people accepting boring, repetitive, exhausting obligations that would never make them famous. That may be the part modern America is least prepared to understand. We still know how to admire heroism. We are much less comfortable with duty. Heroism is dramatic. Duty is getting up tomorrow and doing the same necessary thing again. Heroism gets a movie. Duty gets a ration card, a factory shift, a darkened window, and no applause. The greatest generation did not merely produce brave individuals. It produced a society capable of coordinated sacrifice. People accepted that a shared emergency created shared obligations. They did not need every burden to be personally tailored, emotionally validating, or perfectly equal before agreeing that the work had to be done. That social machinery may be harder to rebuild than any battleship. Modern life has removed enormous amounts of pain, drudgery, hunger, waiting, and danger. That is a triumph. Nobody should romanticize poverty, factory injuries, or war, but every triumph has a shadow. A culture designed to eliminate all friction can forget that some friction is unavoidable. A people protected from hardship can begin to interpret every limit as oppression. A society obsessed with personal expression can lose respect for the unseen people who keep the physical world running. Modern activists talk endlessly about systems, but systems are not slogans floating in the air. Systems are people waking before dawn, maintaining machines, unloading ships, repairing wires, following procedures, and showing up when they would rather stay home. Civilization depends on millions of people doing unglamorous work without turning every inconvenience into a moral emergency. That is why I wonder how we would respond now. Imagine telling modern America to ration, not diet, ration. Imagine telling us the lights have to stay off, the fuel has to be saved, the factory has to run all night, and the product we want is not available because the material is needed somewhere more important. Imagine telling people that the emergency does not care about their personal brand. The meltdown would need its own congressional committee. There would be lawsuits over the ration cards, influencers reviewing blackout curtains, activists arguing that inconvenience itself is violence, and an entire industry teaching people how to process the emotional harm of not getting what they ordered. Meanwhile, somebody would still have to build the ship. Sweetheart, my grandmother processed Hitler with a ration book and a blackout curtain. My grandfather processed Hitler by building battleships. Their parents processed pogroms with packed bags and broken hearts. You can process a little inconvenience. This is not an argument that everyone alive today is weak. Brave people still exist. Disciplined people still exist. People still run toward fires, work double shifts, raise families under pressure, care for the sick, defend countries, and carry burdens without announcing them. The danger is not that courage disappeared. The danger is that the culture no longer knows how to demand it. We praise resilience while removing every opportunity to practice it. We speak about community while treating obligation as coercion. We celebrate workers in theory while recoiling from factories, mines, pipelines, shipyards, and every other place where the material world is actually made. We want the moral credit of sacrifice without the inconvenience of sacrificing. My grandparents did not have that option. They were not made strong because life was gentle. They became strong because life demanded something from them, and because the people around them expected them to answer. Their parents were not hardened because suffering was noble. They were hardened because history kept testing whether Jews could be frightened out of existing. The answer was no, still is. For Jewish families like mine, memory was not nostalgia, it was instruction. The pogroms taught what Jewish vulnerability looked like when the mob was given permission. The Holocaust showed what happens when the mob gets a bureaucracy. The war taught that evil does not retreat because decent people disapprove of it. It retreats when decent people organize, manufacture, fight, endure, and win. Memory is armor, not because it prevents pain, but because it keeps surprise from becoming paralysis. That inheritance passed through Brooklyn kitchens, shipyard gates, ration books, Shabbat candles, arguments, recipes, and family stories. It passed through people who worried constantly and showed up anyway. Jewish Brooklyn adapted, worked, argued, fed everyone anyway, lit candles when possible, and carried light when not. The world may go dark, but we do not become darkness. That is not sentiment, that is survival technology. My grandparents emerged from those years tempered, like steel in the yards. They learned thrift, discipline, gratitude, responsibility, and the fact that nothing precious maintains itself. Food is not guaranteed, electricity is not guaranteed, peace is not guaranteed, freedom is not guaranteed. A safe Jewish life is definitely not guaranteed. Everything precious must be defended, maintained, repaired, and sometimes rebuilt under fire. That lesson has been almost completely lost in a culture that thinks bravery is posting the correct slogan before lunch. History is patient. It waits for every comfortable society to rediscover gravity. When the lights go out, you find out very quickly who has a spine and who has a brand. My grandparents had a spine. They got it honestly, from parents who survived pogroms, from families who carried broken villages inside them, from Jews who crossed oceans because survival required movement, from a people who learned, over and over again, that the purpose of memory is not to keep us afraid, it is to keep us ready. So, yes, I think about them when modern activists cosplay revolution from climate controlled apartments. I think about Brooklyn in the dark. I think about ration books in kitchen drawers. I think about my grandfather building battleships while the Jewish world burned overseas. And behind him, I think about the people who had already seen Jewish homes burn in Ukraine and Russia. The lesson they passed down was simple: survive first, complain later. We are not here because they suffered, we are here because they endured. That is the inheritance, not trauma alone, but strength, not grievance, but duty, not performance, but purpose. The generation that rationed gave us a world comfortable enough to complain about mild discomfort. Fine, that is freedom too. But freedom without discipline becomes fragility. Comfort without gratitude becomes entitlement. A society that cannot tolerate inconvenience will eventually become incapable of defending the conditions that made comfort possible. So the next time the Wi Fi flickers, the oat milk runs out, the eggs cost too much, or someone asks us to give up something small for something larger, we should remember the people who sat in the dark without becoming dim. We should remember the people before them who walked out of burning places carrying only what memory could hold. They did not need the world to be easy, they needed it to be worth saving. And then they got to work. If you enjoy my writing, support me by buying my book, Screaming into the Void, available on paperback or Kindle on Amazon.com.